Hello, my name is Riley. I'm 30 years old, and I'm an FBI intelligence officer, though sometimes it feels like that title carries more weight outside my home than inside it. People hear FBI and imagine power, respect, purpose. They picture someone who walks into danger with confidence and walks out with answers. Maybe that version of me exists out in the world, but the moment I step through my parents' front door, all of that disappears. I become just Riley, the daughter who is never enough, the sister who could never match the perfection of the golden child they raised beside me. I didn't always know the world was unfair. As a kid, you believe what your parents tell you. You think their praise means you're worthy, and their silence means you just need to try harder. Growing up, I tried harder every single day. Every A grade, every award, every certificate I brought home, I waited for the smile, the nod, the simple "I'm proud of you." But those moments rarely came. Not for me. They were saved for someone else. My brother, Caleb. I learned the word favoritism long before I learned the meaning of intelligence work. Caleb was the hero of the house before he'd even done anything heroic. He was the boy who could do no wrong. I used to think every family had a golden child, and maybe they do, but in my home, the glow around Caleb was blinding. If he forgot to do homework, Mom said he must be overwhelmed. If he lied, Dad said it was a misunderstanding. If he raised his voice, everyone said he was just tired. But if I made even the smallest mistake, it meant I was careless, emotional, dramatic, or too sensitive to survive the real world. Maybe that's why I ran toward the hardest world I could find. When I joined the FBI, people told me I was brave. I wasn't. I was just trying to find a place where the truth mattered. A place where the effort you put in came back to you as recognition, not criticism. And for a while it worked. I became good at what I do. I earned respect, trust, and responsibility. But no matter how high I climbed, home was the one place where my accomplishments fell flat, silent, and meaningless. My life changed the day I realized avoidance wouldn't fix anything. I had spent years telling myself that distance was the solution, that I didn't need their approval to breathe. And maybe that was true. But every holiday, every birthday, every phone call was a reminder that running didn't erase the weight I carried. So this year, when Christmas came around, I told myself it was time to stop avoiding the people who raised me. Time to face them with the woman I had become. A woman who wasn't the scared, quiet daughter they once controlled. Driving back home that day, the winter sun soft against the windshield, I kept rehearsing what I would say. I imagined walking in calmly, greeting them with kindness, and keeping the peace. I imagined a version of Christmas where we all pretended for one night that we were a normal family. But deep down, I knew the truth. Families don't magically change on holidays, and parents don't suddenly stop choosing their favorite child just because you've grown up. I knew that. And yet, a part of me still hoped. Hope. It's a strange thing. It keeps you alive, but it also keeps you tied to the places that hurt you most. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, a thin layer of snow rested on the roof, untouched and peaceful. A picture-perfect scene. The kind you'd see on a Christmas card. But happiness has never lived inside that house. Not for me. Still, I took a deep breath, straightened my jacket, and stepped out of the car. I didn't know then that this Christmas would break something in me forever, or that it would finally set me free. I think every child grows up believing their family is normal until one day they realize it isn't. For me, that realization didn't come in one sudden moment. It came slowly, quietly, like cold water rising around my ankles until I finally understood I was standing in a flood. I was 8 when I first noticed the difference. Caleb and I were both in grade school at the time. He was loud, charming, impulsive, the kind of kid teachers described as energetic, even when he hadn't done a single piece of homework. I, on the other hand, was quiet, organized, always turning assignments in early. And yet, no matter how well I performed, the attention in our home flowed in only one direction. I remember one night in particular. I had won a spelling bee at school, beating 25 students. I ran home with the certificate in my hand, excited, breathless, ready to show Mom and Dad. When I handed it to them, Mom gave a half smile and said, "That's nice, Riley." She placed the paper on the counter without even reading it. Not even a second later, Caleb walked in crying because he'd lost a soccer ball in the neighbor's yard. Dad rushed over, wrapped him in his arms, and spent 20 minutes comforting him as if the sky had fallen. That night, my certificate ended up under a stack of mail. No one ever mentioned it again. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. Maybe they loved us equally and just showed it differently. But as the years went on, the pattern never changed. If Caleb made a mess, Mom cleaned it. If I made a mess, I was irresponsible. If Caleb forgot a chore, Dad laughed and did it himself. If I forgot, I was lectured for being careless. By the time I was 12, I understood the vocabulary, even if no one said it aloud. Caleb was the center of their world, and I existed somewhere on the edges. It wasn't only the chores or the awards. It was everything. Holidays revolved around him. Vacations were planned around what he wanted. When he played baseball, we all became a baseball family. When he quit baseball, we all learned to pretend baseball had never existed. My interests were something I explored alone, quiet things like books, puzzles, science kits. I learned early on how to raise myself without making too much noise. I didn't resent Caleb then. How could I? He was my brother. He didn't choose to be favored. He just benefited from the system that already worshipped him. But I did start to resent the way my parents molded our roles. Caleb was the charismatic son destined for greatness. I was the dependable daughter expected to adjust, absorb, and accept whatever space they gave me. There were moments I tried to speak up, small attempts to ask, "What about me?" But those conversations always ended the same way. Dad would say I was being dramatic. Mom would say I needed to be more understanding. Caleb would smirk because he knew, whether he earned it or not, the throne was his. The irony is that the older we grew, the more our paths split in opposite directions. Caleb became reckless, entitled, always searching for shortcuts. I became disciplined, driven, desperate to build a life defined by my own choices instead of the ones forced on me. And yet, no matter how far I climbed, back home the narrative never changed. Caleb could do no wrong. I could do no right. Looking back now, I realize those early years shaped everything, the way I loved, the way I worked, the way I fought for recognition in a world that constantly underestimated me. I spent my entire childhood trying to earn the approval that was handed to Caleb without effort. And maybe that's exactly why the moment he finally crossed the line, I knew I couldn't keep pretending anymore. When people hear that I work for the FBI, they imagine a life filled with action, adrenaline, and purpose. And yes, parts of it are exactly that. My days often begin before sunrise, with encrypted briefings, surveillance updates, or intelligence leads that could alter the course of an entire investigation. I've interrogated people who would lie without blinking, and I've tracked criminals who thought they were invisible. I've been in rooms where every second mattered. I've made decisions that carried consequences far beyond my own life. Out there, in that world, my voice carries weight. My opinions matter. My instincts save lives. I'm respected, not because of who I am related to, but because of the work I've done. And yet, it's strange how all that strength seems to fade the moment I think about home. It's like I become two different people living in the same body. At work, I'm Agent Riley Carter, sharp, steady, trusted. But inside my family, I'm simply Riley, the daughter who talks too seriously, the sister who overreacts, the woman whose career is treated like a hobby she'll eventually get over. It's funny, in a painful way, how the world can see you clearly, while the people closest to you refuse to look past their own expectations. My coworkers know me as someone who keeps her emotions in check, someone who doesn't crumble under pressure. But they don't see the moments when I sit in my car outside the office, taking a deep breath before calling my parents, hoping this time the conversation won't leave me feeling small. They don't know the heaviness I carry when I leave a successful operation, one that took months of planning, only to hear my mother ask, "You're still doing that job? Isn't it dangerous? Shouldn't you settle down by now?" As if settling down cancels out everything I've achieved. The truth is, the FBI became the first place where I felt seen. It was the first time someone looked at me and said, "You're capable. You're valuable. You're needed." I wasn't the backup child, or the forgotten child, or the one expected to dim her light so her brothers could shine. I learned to stand tall, to trust my intelligence, to trust myself. I learned that I could be more than the role my family carved out for me. But no amount of courage at work could erase the dread that came whenever I had to return home. Every holiday invitation felt like a test I didn't want to take. I'd sit at my desk staring at the message Mom sent. "Christmas dinner. Be here by 5. No warmth. No excitement. No mention of looking forward to seeing me. The unspoken message was always clear. This wasn't about family. It was about maintaining the image of one. Sometimes at work, while reviewing classified files, I'd catch myself wondering why I still tried. Why I still showed up to a house that greeted me with silence. Why I still hoped for a mother who would ask how my day was, or a father who would say he was proud of me, or a brother who didn't treat my accomplishments like punchlines in his personal comedy routine. Maybe some part of me believed they would change. Maybe some small piece of my heart still wanted to believe that love, even when uneven, was worth fighting for. But as Christmas approached that year, the one that changed everything, I could feel something shifting inside me. A quiet strength. A kind of acceptance. I wasn't going home to be forgiven or celebrated. I was going home because I needed to face the truth. I needed to stop pretending that the hurt didn't matter. I just didn't know then that the truth waiting for me would hit harder than any case I'd ever worked on. The drive to my parents' house always felt longer than it actually was. It wasn't the distance, it was the weight. The kind that settles in your chest and stays there, making every mile feel like a choice between who you've become and who you used to be. As the highways stretched ahead, lined with bare winter trees and patches of untouched snow, I kept telling myself this Christmas would be different. Not because they had changed, but because I had. I wasn't the same girl who walked on eggshells. I wasn't the daughter who apologized for taking up space. I wasn't the sister who stayed quiet just to avoid conflict. I was a woman now, a federal agent who had faced far worse than a cold household and a bitter brother. And yet, my hands still tightened on the steering wheel when the first familiar exit sign appeared. I tried to focus on the small things, the sound of the heater humming in the car, the way the sky glowed a soft orange as the sun dipped behind the clouds, the snowflakes collecting at the corners of the windshield. Anything to quiet the familiar thoughts that rushed back every time I returned home. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was anticipation mixed with disappointment, a mixture I'd learned to swallow since childhood. Even as an adult, I still found myself hoping for something gentler, some warmth, some acknowledgement, some basic recognition that I belonged there. But Christmas wasn't magic. And my family wasn't the kind that transformed when the calendar changed. When I finally turned onto their street, the houses were lit with bright decorations, glowing reindeer, twinkling roof lights, wreaths on doors. Everyone seemed eager to celebrate. Everyone except the house at the end of the block. My parents' home sat dark, undecorated, and quiet. It always did. They used to say decorations were unnecessary, a waste of time, something only people with nothing better to do bothered with. I used to believe that, too, until I realized decorating wasn't about appearance. It was about trying, about creating joy where there wasn't any. But joy wasn't something we practiced much growing up. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, letting the engine tick softly as it cooled. Through the front window, I could see shadows moving, my mother pacing, my father sitting, and Caleb leaning back with something in his hand, probably a drink. I could almost hear the tone of the room before I even opened the door. I took a slow breath, straightened my jacket, and stepped out. The cold air hit me immediately, sharp and grounding. In that instant, I reminded myself why I was here. Not for their approval, not for their affection, but because I needed to stop running from the version of myself they had created. When I knocked, the door opened just wide enough for my mother to appear. No smile, no warmth. Just her eyes flicking over me, as if checking whether I had followed the dress code for disappointment. "You're late," she said. No hello. No hug. Inside, the house looked the same. Dim lighting, cold walls, and the familiar heaviness that always replaced the holiday spirit. Dad glanced at me with a quick nod, nothing more. And Caleb, he didn't even bother to stand. He just smirked, lifted his glass, and said, "Well, look who finally decided to show up." That was my welcome home. Dinner was supposed to start at 6, but by the time the food was finally on the table, no one seemed remotely interested in celebrating. The air felt thick, heavy with everything we weren't saying. Mom moved around quietly, setting down dishes without looking at me, and Dad kept checking his phone, as if he had somewhere more important to be. Caleb, on the other hand, was perfectly comfortable, leaning back in his chair with a drink in his hand, soaking in the attention that came so naturally to him. He didn't see me walk in. Or maybe he did, and simply didn't care. "Riley," Dad said, breaking the silence. "Sit down." It wasn't an invitation. It was an instruction. I pulled out a chair and sat, feeling the familiar tension settle onto my shoulders. Ever since I arrived, not a single person had asked about my life, my work, or even how I'd been. It was as if I were an outsider visiting strangers, a stranger expected to behave perfectly while being treated as invisible. Mom finally sat down, wiping her hands on a napkin, and forced a thin smile. "Well," she muttered, "let's eat before it gets cold." For a few minutes, the only sounds were clinking silverware and Caleb pouring himself another drink. I tried to focus on my plate, pretending not to notice the way he kept glancing at me with that smug grin. I knew that expression. He was bored, restless, hungry for attention. And whenever Caleb wanted attention, he always found a way to steal it. "So," he finally said, his voice loud enough to cut through the quiet, "Agent Riley Carter. Tell us, save any lives recently? Or just doing paperwork these days?" He laughed at his own joke before anyone else could react. Mom chuckled softly, not because it was funny, but because Caleb had spoken. Dad shook his head in fake amusement. I put my fork down and breathed slowly. I could feel the familiar heat rising in my chest, that mixture of humiliation and exhaustion that always came with being the target of Caleb's entertainment. "It's been a busy year," I replied calmly. "We wrapped up a major intelligence op last month." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Oh, right, that thing you always brag about. The invisible cases no one ever sees, no one ever hears about, but somehow we're all supposed to be impressed." He rolled his eyes dramatically. "Spare us the hero speech." "Caleb," I said gently, "I'm not giving a speech. You asked." He smirked. "Yeah, and I regret it already." Dad laughed. Mom shook her head as if I had embarrassed them all by speaking at all. I stared at my plate, pressing my nails into my palm to keep myself steady. I had walked into interrogation rooms with men twice my size and never felt as belittled as I did sitting at that table with my own family. "I don't understand why you take everything so seriously," Caleb continued. "It's like you think you're above us because you have a badge." "I never said that," I replied, keeping my voice level. "Oh, come on," he snapped, leaning forward. "You walk around like some national hero, but honestly, Riley, what do you even do? Sit at a computer and type all day? Anyone can do that." I swallowed hard. "You know nothing about my job. And you know nothing about this family," he shot back. "You show up once a year and suddenly act like you deserve respect. You don't." The words hit harder than they should have. But what came next, that was the moment everything shattered. Mom slammed her hand on the table. "Caleb, stop. You're upsetting her." But he wasn't listening. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. "She upsets herself. She always plays the victim. Always has. Always will." Then he stepped closer, pointing at me. "You think you're special? You're not." Something inside me shifted. I rose slowly, not to fight, just to breathe. "I'm done listening to this." "Oh, really?" he said, stepping forward. "Running away like always?" Before I could react, he shoved me hard. I stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the table before crashing onto the floor. Pain shot through my side, and I felt warmth at my temple, where I'd struck the chair leg. For a moment, the room spun. And then, silence. Mom gasped. Dad froze. Caleb stared at me, his chest rising and falling, anger still burning in his eyes. And then my mother whispered the sentence that confirmed everything I'd ever known about my place in this family. "Riley, you must have slipped." I lay there on the floor, bleeding, and realized this was the moment my old life ended. For a moment, I couldn't move. Not because of the pain, but because of how quickly the truth had been twisted. I had just been shoved hard enough to make my vision blur, and yet the first words out of my mother's mouth were an excuse for the one who hurt me. Lying there on the floor, I felt something inside me detach, like a thread finally snapping after years of tension. I pushed myself up slowly, ignoring the sting at my temple. My parents didn't rush to help me. They didn't even stand. Caleb took a step back, breathing hard, his eyes darting between me and our parents, as if waiting to see whether anyone would hold him accountable. No one did. "I'm fine," I murmured, more to myself than to them. I steadied my hand on the table, trying not to show how shaken I really was. "I just need a minute." I walked toward the hallway, my steps uneven, my mind buzzing with confusion, anger, and clarity all at once. I wasn't okay. Not physically, not emotionally, but I knew one thing for certain. I needed to get out of that house before the version of reality they forced on me swallowed me whole again. When I reached the guest room, my childhood room long since repurposed, I closed the door quietly behind me. The moment the latch clicked, the facade slipped. My breath trembled, and I leaned against the wall, holding my side where the bruise was already forming. It wasn't the shove that hurt the most, it was the lie. The way my mother's voice had softened not for me, but for him. The way my father avoided my eyes. The way Caleb didn't apologize, didn't flinch, didn't even seem surprised at himself. But even through the pain, a familiar instinct kicked in, calm assessment, logical thinking, the same mindset that had carried me through countless investigations. Emotion couldn't solve this. Evidence could. I walked to the small desk by the window and opened my laptop. The house had security cameras. My parents installed them years ago after a break-in scare. Indoor and outdoor, all connected to the same system. They occasionally forgot the cameras were there. I never did. And tonight, those cameras might be the only witnesses who didn't lie. My hands shook as I logged into the system, typing the password I had helped Dad set up back when he still trusted me with things like that. The feed opened, and I scrubbed backward through the timeline to dinner. There it was, every second, every word, every movement. The angle from the dining room corner caught it all perfectly. Caleb rising, shouting, stepping toward me, and pushing me with full force. It was undeniable. For the first time that night, I felt steady. I copied the footage to an external drive I kept in my bag, an old habit from field assignments, and watched the progress bar fill slowly. Every second felt like a small reclaiming of power I'd been denied for years. When the file finished saving, I closed the laptop, took one last look around the room that had never really belonged to me, and exhaled. That footage wasn't just evidence. It was my exit. I left the house without saying goodbye. No one followed me. No one called out my name. The cold air outside felt almost cleansing after the suffocating silence inside. I sat in my car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, the ache in my ribs pulsing with every breath. I could have driven home. I could have convinced myself to let it go, to stay quiet like I always had. But something had changed tonight, something in me that refused to shrink back into the role they had written for me. For once, the truth wasn't trapped inside my head. It was in my hands, recorded clearly, irrefutably. I drove straight to the precinct. When I walked into the station, the officer at the front desk immediately noticed the cut on my temple. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, standing a little straighter. There was something surreal about being treated with concern by a stranger after being dismissed so easily by my own family. "I'd like to file a domestic assault report," I said. My voice didn't shake. I opened my bag, pulled out the external drive containing the footage, and placed it on the counter. "And I have video evidence." His expression shifted, not pity, not judgment, just professionalism. He handed me a form and guided me to a private room. As I filled in the details, I felt the weight of each word. Each line was a step away from the version of the story my family would try to create. When I finished, the officer gently asked, "Do you feel safe tonight? Do you need medical assistance?" I shook my head. "I just need this on record." He nodded and took the drive to review the footage. I waited, hands folded, breath steady. A few minutes later, a detective walked in, his tone firm. "Ms. Carter, the video clearly shows physical assault. Based on what we've seen, we're opening a case immediately. Your brother will be contacted. There will likely be an arrest." Hearing those words felt strange, not satisfying, not gratifying, but grounding. The truth was finally outside of me, acknowledged by someone who had no reason to deny it. The next few days were a blur of statements, paperwork, and calls from investigators. I didn't hear a word from my parents. Not even a message. I wasn't surprised. I doubted they had even asked whether I was okay. But Caleb reacted exactly how I expected. He claimed I exaggerated. He claimed I slipped. He claimed the camera angle was misleading. He claimed everything except the truth. But the footage didn't care about excuses. When the charges were officially filed, I was notified that the case would move to a hearing. I didn't want a courtroom battle with my own brother, but he had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. For years, I had absorbed the hurt quietly. This time, I wasn't the one on trial for existing. My attorney prepared me for the worst. Caleb denying everything, my parents taking his side, their attorney attempting to shift blame onto me. "But don't worry," she said. "The evidence is strong. Be calm. Be honest. The truth is on your side." For the first time in my life, those words actually felt real. As the court date approached, I stood in front of my mirror, looking at the fading bruise on my temple. I wasn't afraid of Caleb anymore. I wasn't afraid of their version of me. I wasn't even afraid of facing them in a courtroom. I was only afraid of how long it had taken me to finally fight back. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse felt colder than the December air outside. I walked through the glass doors with steady steps, reminding myself that this wasn't just about the shove at Christmas dinner. It was about years of being silenced, minimized, and pushed aside, both figuratively and literally. My attorney met me at the entrance, offering a reassuring nod before guiding me toward the courtroom. Inside, everything felt too bright, too quiet, too formal for the mess my family had become. Caleb was already there, sitting beside his lawyer with the same arrogance I'd seen at the dinner table. When he glanced at me, he didn't look ashamed or nervous. He looked annoyed, as if all of this were an inconvenience I had forced upon him. My parents sat behind him, Mom with her lips pressed tight, Dad with his arms crossed. Not one of them met my eyes. It was almost impressive how united they could be when the goal was to protect Caleb. When the proceedings began, the statements unfolded exactly the way my attorney predicted. Caleb claimed I had slipped. He claimed he'd reached out to help me and I had misinterpreted the situation. His lawyer emphasized how close-knit our family was and how tragic it would be to let one misunderstanding break us apart. Mom even took the stand, insisting Caleb was gentle, that he would never hurt me. Dad followed, repeating the same narrative with practiced calm. Listening to them felt like watching strangers play the roles of my parents. Their voices were steady, confident, familiar, and completely false. It hurt more than I expected, though I kept my expression steady. Years of training had taught me how to control my breathing under pressure. I used every skill I had to stay calm now. Finally, it was my turn. I told the truth. Not with theatrics, not with emotion, just facts. What he said, what he did, what I felt. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told the story the way it happened, step by painful step. Then my attorney gave the judge the external drive. The courtroom fell silent as the footage began to play on the monitor mounted on the wall. There it was, Caleb's voice rising, his insults. The moment he stepped closer, the shove, my fall. Clear. Unquestionable. Undeniable. I watched Caleb's confidence fade as the video continued. He shifted in his seat, jaw tightening, eyes avoiding the screen. Mom covered her mouth with her hand. Dad stared at the floor. When the footage ended, the room stayed quiet for several seconds. Judge Bennett leaned forward, his expression stern in a way that made my heartbeat finally slow. He delivered the verdict with unwavering clarity. Caleb was guilty of domestic assault. He was sentenced to probation, community service, mandatory anger management, and a restraining order preventing him from coming near me for a year. The judge warned him harshly about the seriousness of his actions, and then he turned to my parents, telling them that their false statements had come dangerously close to perjury. Caleb didn't look back at me as officers escorted him out. But I wasn't looking for his eyes anymore. For the first time in my life, I was standing firmly on the side of the truth, and no one could twist it again. When the hearing ended, I walked out of the courthouse alone. Not a single member of my family followed me, not to apologize, not to question, not even to accuse. They simply stayed behind with the wreckage they had chosen to defend. For a moment, I wondered if I should feel guilty. After all, Caleb was my brother. David and Karen were my parents. But the guilt never came. What arrived instead was a strange, unfamiliar lightness, like stepping out of a room where the oxygen had been thinning for years. In the weeks that followed, everything unraveled for them just as predictably as the seasons change. Caleb's conviction became public record, which made it impossible for him to hold onto his job. My parents drained their savings trying to help him with legal fees they could not afford. Their bills piled up, their mortgage slipped behind, and the home they once protected so fiercely for me was now slipping away from them piece by piece. Eventually, foreclosure notices arrived. The house at the end of the block, the place where I'd spent my entire childhood shrinking myself, was no longer theirs. With their finances exhausted and their reputation fractured, David and Karen had no choice but to move into an assisted living facility. Not because they were too old, but because they were too depleted, emotionally, financially, and morally. I didn't visit them. I didn't call. And they didn't reach out to me either. Maybe they were ashamed. Maybe they still believed their version of the story. Or maybe they finally realized the cost of choosing one child so completely that they lost the other entirely. As for me, I didn't go back to the apartment I'd been renting before. Instead, I found a new place, a bright space with tall windows, warm light, and quiet that felt intentional rather than forced. I filled it slowly, not with memories from my past, but with pieces of a future I was finally free to create. Plants I remembered to water. A bookshelf I built myself. A small framed print above my desk that said, "You owe yourself the love you freely give." Megan visited often, bringing takeout and teasing me for buying too many candles. For the first time in a long time, I felt surrounded not by people who tolerated me, but by people who truly saw me. My life didn't magically transform overnight, but it was mine now, unapologetically and completely. Sometimes I sit by my window at night, watching the city lights flicker like tiny choices, some bright, some fading, some burning out quietly without anyone noticing. And I think about the girl I used to be, the one who kept waiting for her family to change, the one who believed that love meant enduring everything, even when it broke her a little more each year. I stayed far too long in places that didn't treat me as someone worth staying for. I kept shrinking myself to fit a version of daughter, sister, peacemaker, even when none of those roles ever fit me. But walking away from them wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning. Healing didn't come in a single moment. It came slowly, quietly, through ordinary days where no one yelled at me, no one dismissed me, no one made me feel small. It came through laughter with Megan, long walks alone, new routines, new hope. It came through understanding something I wish I had learned years earlier. Family is not defined by blood. Family is defined by safety, by truth, by love that lifts you, not love that bruises you. I don't hate my parents. I don't hate Caleb. Hate would still tie me to them. Instead, I let go. Completely. Because letting go isn't weakness. It's choosing peace over chaos, truth over illusion, freedom over fear. If you're listening to my story, maybe you've carried similar wounds. Maybe you've spent years trying to earn the affection of people who never learned how to see you. And if that's the case, then hear me carefully. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to choose yourself. And you are allowed to build a life where you are not an afterthought, but a whole, powerful, undeniable presence. My name is Riley Carter. I survived the house I grew up in. And now, I am finally living the life I deserved all along. Thank you for listening to this story. If Riley's journey touched your heart or gave you strength, make sure to like this video. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more real-life inspired stories. Your support helps these stories reach others who may need them. Stay strong, stay hopeful, and I'll see you in the next story.